A man armed with an AR-15 style rifle opened fire into an FBI building in Cincinnati using a nail gun. After, I believe, an alarm was triggered, the man fled. This is a breaking story. I recorded a little bit earlier than when it was published, when the story first broke, so there may be many more developments. But at the time of recording the segment, the man has not been apprehended. They say only contained. Reports were saying that after he fled the building and was pursued, he began firing at police from a cornfield. Ladies and gentlemen, when I say civil war, it is not because I'm sitting back watching movies and fantasizing or believing in things that aren't in the realm of possibility. It's because what is happening in this country is devolving. We will get into the breaking news from this story, and I'll go through the details, but we have a lot more going on. FBI Director Wray has already condemned violent rhetoric. We're now hearing numerous reports claiming that on the fringe right, people are getting more and more violent in response to the FBI raid on Donald Trump. But my friends, the raid on Donald Trump was the crossing of the Rubicon. That's not my quote. That's George Conway, a critic of Trump. Now, I did actually say the same thing, but I'm quoting him when I say it now, because the point is, anyone can agree something has changed. And this is what we are likely to see. And I condemn it and reject it, as we all should. The people who have seen war tend to be the ones saying you do not want it. But a lot of people keep saying, what do you do? How do you deal with this? Ladies and gentlemen, there is an election coming up where potentially Trump MAGA supporting Republicans are about to sweep. And when they do, we may actually see something. I don't know. I don't know for sure. But right now, I have to question who would do this and why. Of course, on the right, Trump supporters are screaming Fed and false flag because they do not support it. It's convenient, isn't it? With only a few months to a midterm election that could see Republicans issuing subpoenas and investigating the bureaucratic state and other civil servants. Potentially what was done to Donald Trump, especially with the FBI raid, only a few months before. We're now seeing FBI's subpoenaing the cell phones of sitting members of Congress, raiding the home of the former president. We have seen members of his administration arrested, convicted, even shackled at the legs. Something dark is already happening. Now, again, this could be because someone snapped and they just said enough and they're losing it. This, in my opinion, is a huge mistake. This will help the Democrats win. And I can only imagine, actually, I'll put it this way. Many have speculated. Some news outlets have actually written op-eds or published op-eds saying that the goal of the FBI raid may be to rile up Trump supporters and people on the right to engage in acts of violence so it destroys the Republicans' chance of winning in the midterms. Because short of something like this, I don't see what they have. But this is exactly what the Democrats needed. Someone to get violent. I can't remember whose quote it was. It may be Noam Chomsky. They said, when you get violent, they know how to deal with you. It's when you're nonviolent, they don't know what to do. Because they have carte blanche on how to deal with violence. Something like this, you will see it plastered across every TV screen, every billboard will say Trump supporters are violent criminals and terrorists. And they will use this as fodder, as a weapon in November. But that's why I'm not convinced this is a legitimate political action. This person probably was just either deranged or was trying to hurt conservatives or Trump. But the reality is he may just be deranged. The simple solution in the absence of evidence, the one that makes the least amount of assumptions may be correct. I think people may just be losing it. This country may be falling apart. And I will say it again. I think civil war is nigh, or we're in it and it's fifth generational. I've been saying it for some time. You know, a lot of people doubted me and they said that I was wrong and that I was crazy. And I'm not saying definitively I know for sure it will. I'm saying likely. Just to clarify, I think we're heading in that direction and it just keeps escalating. But years ago, they said it would never even get to this point. And then January 6th happened and all of a sudden the Democrats changed their tune. The other night we had Naomi Wolf on the show, classical liberal, now railing on Democrats, says she thinks a civil war is coming. It's not just me. It's people across the spectrum. Again, George Conway said they've crossed the Rubicon. I want to read the story. Before we do, head over to timcast.com and become a member if you want to support our work. As a member, you'll get access to our exclusive members-only segments from the Timcast IRL podcast, Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m., as well as our other shows like Tales from the Inverted World, which is on season 2 right now. Check it out on the website. And I believe Cast Castle will be officially launching in its new format in just about a week. We're trying to make sure we do it right. It's been delayed. A lot of people who are fans say it's got an identity crisis. It is. We're trying not to just end it. We're trying to make something with it because we can. And with your support, we're going to make something really awesome. But also check out Pop Culture Crisis as well. Smash the like button. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Let's read the news and talk about what's happening in this country. Man armed with AR-15 style rifle shoots into FBI Cincinnati building with a nail gun and flees, leading to interstate standoff, reports NBC News. 2 law enforcement sources told NBC News that a man got inside and fired a nail gun toward FBI personnel. This is interesting. Why would he not use the rifle he had? Perhaps because the nail gun is quieter? I'm not entirely sure. They say an armed man flashing an AR-15 style rifle fired a nail gun into an FBI Cincinnati building Thursday morning, leading to a police pursuit. Now, I'd also want to say, why didn't they say he fired it at FBI personnel? At approximately 9:15 Eastern, the FBI Cincinnati field office had an armed subject attempt to breach the visitor screening facility. FBI Cincinnati said in a statement, upon the activation of an alarm and a response by armed FBI special agents, the subject fled northbound onto Interstate 71. Clinton Co. Emergency Management Agency alerted that Interstate 71 was closed in both directions between about 5 exits. Law enforcement has traded shots with a male suspect who was wearing a gray shirt and body armor, the agency said in a statement, warning people nearby to stay inside and lock their doors. At about 12:30, the agency said the suspect was contained but not in custody. Lockdown still in effect for 1 mile radius of Center and Smith Roads. Clinton Co. Emergency Management Agency said on Facebook, remain vigilant, and if you are in the area, report anything suspicious to 911. This is a breaking story. So again, by the time you watch this, there probably will have been many updates. You know, when the news broke, I immediately just got to recording something. But the bigger story that I want to get to is where we're heading after the FBI raid on Donald Trump. So while this occurred, I was already putting together a segment. As many of you know, I talk about civil war quite a bit. It's a meme, basically, where there's a really funny one, actually, where it's a guy and he's like stroking his beard and there's like a woman shaking her butt at him. And they put a beanie on the woman and civil war on the butt. And the guy, it says, me trying to live a normal life. And that was the gag, like me being like civil war, but like, you know, a hot woman shaking her butt. Anyway, I digress. You get the point. There's a reason why I talk about this, because I read the news all day, every day. I read hundreds of articles per day. This is why I often remember a bunch of these random stories. If you watch IRL, I'll just like, remember that story from 2013 where because I just read nonstop. When I see all the pieces laid out in front of me and I see the national security experts saying, here's what happens in these places, when I've witnessed civil unrest and civil war in certain countries, and then I see these things happening, my friends, there's a reason why I'm saying I believe we are on track for a civil war still to this day. I think things are going to get much worse from here. There's a bunch of different stories talking about this. Armed gunman tried to break into the building. Apparently he did. The initial reporting said that he attacked the FBI building and fled, was shooting from a cornfield. They say the building is no longer under threat. CNN reported this just yesterday. Violent rhetoric circulates on the pro-Trump internet following FBI search, including against a judge, by Donnie O'Sullivan. This is what the Democrats were praying for. And maybe some have speculated the FBI knew this was going to happen, and maybe Democrats were hoping it would, because they can use this to try and win elections in the midterms. You see, we know that Democratic organizations have been funding the messages of pro-Trump candidates, and many asked why. The strategy is simple. They said MAGA candidates can't win a general election, and so they would prefer it if Trump's people won, and then in the general, the Democrats offered up a moderate option. Well, that idea sounds crazy because they're just propping up these ideas from Trump supporting candidates, right? Unless they intend to smear these candidates as insurrectionists and violent terrorists and criminals and scare the general public, which may be about to happen. CNN reports, quote, "Lock and load was one of the top comments on an online forum dedicated to former President Donald Trump on Monday night. Soon after it emerged, his Florida Mar-a-Lago resort had been searched by the FBI. Other posts were more explicit." I'm not going to read these comments. I'm not going to read what they're posting. Violence should not be tolerated. And I genuinely mean that. This is why, again, Trump supporters are calling these people feds. Because anybody who knows the game that's being played knows what's at stake in less than 3 months. They know the prize. I'll say this for everybody, too. The prize is sitting but 3 months away, and that is control of Congress. And it will be attained through peaceful means and the peaceful transfer of power. Unless, of course, Democrats are intent on making sure that doesn't happen. Why would someone engage in this attack right before a midterm election? Why not earlier? Okay, well, maybe it's because it's a crazy guy and the feds went after Trump. I think that's a fair assessment. This guy's crazy. He went after Trump. Well, bad news for Trump supporters. They're going to use this against you. They're going to mention that combing through posts from certain individuals, they can see that people were making threats. One individual had been charged. Quote, "We are seeing conspiratorial rhetoric from elected officials, political leaders, and political entertainers that is fueling calls for real-world violence," Jones said. "The conspiratorial and divisive rhetoric from elected officials and others who should know better is continuing to undermine our institutions and democracy at an alarming rate." And I can only imagine these people are saying this. This is Daniel L. Jones, a former Senate investigator. They're twirling their mustache as they say it because they're doing the exact same thing. And they have been. It was the Democrats who claimed that the 2016 election was stolen, that they tried to block the electors. Then they come out and deny ever having been election deniers, and powerful tech institutions threaten to ban you if you challenge the election. From NBC, FBI's Wray denounces threats following search of Trump's home. Wray called threats circulating online against federal agents in the Justice Department deplorable and dangerous. How interesting. Wray made the remarks following a news conference during a long-planned visit to the agency's field office in Omaha, Nebraska, where he discussed the FBI's focus on cybersecurity. He declined to answer questions about the hours-long search Monday by FBI agents of Trump's Palm Beach, Florida resort. It has been easy to find the threats and a call to arms in those corners of the internet favored by right-wing extremists since Trump himself announced the search of his Florida home. Reactions including the ubiquitous lock and load and calls for assassinations. Did you know that a man tried to assassinate a Supreme Court justice? That's right. I don't care about the rhetoric. I mean, it's bad, but I mean to say, I don't care about these stories. It doesn't matter about what side you're on. Right now, as a human being, you need to understand something. Someone tried to assassinate Brett Kavanaugh. They arrested him. Good. I'm glad they did. The AG would not go after people who are illegally protesting in front of judges' homes. We do have a restriction on that, and I understand why. There can be no First Amendment without the ability for justice to be found. That was the argument, that if a judge could be coerced, there's no justice. Then there's no free speech. There's no Constitution. Agreed. I don't want a judge to be like, I'm going to rule on a constitutional issue, and then someone shows up, protests, terrifies him, and then he changes his mind. I think that should be one of the simple limitations. What we're seeing now are extremists in any capacity on any side ramping things up, and we need it to stop. You see, this is the worst possible thing for the right because they're poised to take the House and potentially the Senate. So none of this. It's all bad. But outside of that, I'll just tell you right now, man, I hope you've prepared for what everyone keeps clamoring about. Since 2018, we've had articles talking about the potential for civil war because they didn't like Donald Trump because of the threat that Russia posed with an asset in the White House. Of course, I think that was all a lot of nonsense, and I think that was definitively proven. Now, we can see the escalation. The New York Times reports the FBI search ignited the language of violence and civil war on the far right. That's the story being put up by the mainstream press, the corporate propagandists. And the message we can see from Unheard is quite simple. America's tribes are ready for war. After Mar-a-Lago, the middle ground has been plundered. I want to read this and give you some historical context. It's interesting. But first, I want to show you this from NPR yesterday. A Florida license plate has reopened the debate over the Don't Tread on Me flag. When Florida Governor Ron DeSantis recently tweeted an image of what he said was a new state license plate featuring the coiled rattlesnake and the words "Don't tread on me," he said it sends a clear message to out-of-state cars. The imagery of the Revolutionary War era Gadsden flag dates to Benjamin Franklin, but has, for many, come to symbolize a far-right extremist ideology and the Stop the Steal movement. They have tried to associate the Gadsden flag, a flag of American history, with every negative group imaginable. I remember years ago, they were like, it's a white supremacist flag. It's a flag of America. They're trying to tell you that your history is extremist. If they believe that this is far-right extremism, then my view is there is a parasitic growth, a brain slug spreading inside this country, demonizing its own existence. And I see that just ending dangerously and dramatically, and it's worrisome. But here's where we may be going from Unheard. Dominic Sandbrook writes, Thursday, 22 May 1856, was a sunny, sleepy day in Washington, D.C. as Preston Brooks, the Democratic representative from South Carolina's 4th District, strolled into the Senate chamber. The air felt hot and heavy. The Senate's business had wound down. The galleries had almost emptied. Brooks glanced up and waited for the last spectators to leave. It was important, he thought, that no ladies were present to watch what he had planned. When he was satisfied, Brooks walked over to the desk of Massachusetts Republican Senator Charles Sumner, who was busy writing and barely even looked up. Between the two men, there was no love lost. Brooks, who walked with a cane after having been injured in a youthful duel, was a passionate defender of slavery. Sumner, by contrast, was one of the nation's most outspoken abolitionists. Only days earlier, he had delivered a blistering speech mocking Brooks's cousin, Senator Andrew Butler, as a hapless Don Quixote-style knight devoted to the harlot, slavery. To Brooks, the speech seemed an intolerable affront. At first, he had considered challenging Sumner to a duel, but decided against it on the grounds that the Massachusetts politician was no gentleman. But he remained determined to take his revenge. And now, as Sumner glanced dismissively up, Brooks spoke. Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine. At that, Sumner tried to rise, but Brooks was too quick for him. He lifted his thick gutta-percha cane with its heavy golden top and brought it savagely down on Sumner's head again and again. Sumner fell. Blood trickled down his face. He was trapped behind his desk. He could not get up. Still the blows rained down, Brooks lashing away like a man possessed. Sumner was unconscious now. At last, some of Brooks' colleagues managed to pull him off. A pool of blood spread across the floor of the Senate. Although Charles Sumner didn't die that afternoon, the sheer violence of the assault struck many Americans, even at the time, as a terrible harbinger of the horror ahead. But while thousands of anti-slavery Northerners joined rallies in Sumner's support, the reaction in the South was very different. Ordinary people sent Brooks hundreds of new canes to replace his own shattered weapon. One was inscribed, "Hit him again." Many Southern politicians insisted that Sumner had exaggerated his injuries, dismissing the fake news of the abolitionist media. And on the fire-breathing wing of the Southern press, there was no doubt about who was really in the wrong. Brooks's attack was good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequences, declared the Richmond Inquirer. Ideally, it said the vulgar abolitionists of the Senate should be lashed into submission. Today, historians see the Brooks-Sumner confrontation as a milestone of the United States road to the Civil War, encapsulating the collapse of civility, the triumph of tribalism, and the disappearance of the political middle ground. I've been thinking about it a lot over the past couple of years, and I thought about it again this week amid the frenzied reaction to the FBI's raid on Donald Trump's home in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, where he's alleged to have taken and even tried to destroy confidential government documents. Put aside if you can, your own views about the rights and wrongs of the FBI raid. Perhaps it really is a sign of the overreach of the deep state, determined to smear and undermine a decent American patriot. Or perhaps it's a welcome reminder that nobody, not even a former president, is above the law. Perhaps you think Donald Trump isn't the kind of man who would trample roughshod over rules and conventions. Perhaps you simply can't imagine him making off with classified records and trying to flush them down the toilet. Or perhaps you think he is, and you can. But this isn't really the issue. Does anybody really see the fate of Donald Trump's paperwork as the most pressing challenge facing the American Republic? The more interesting question, as with the caning of Charles Sumner in 1856, is what the whole imbroglio tells us about the health or otherwise of American politics. As soon as news of the FBI raid broke, Republicans almost unanimously rushed to denounce the agency's abuse of power and defend the former president as a victim of a witch hunt. Would they, I wonder, have said the same thing if, say, the FBI had raided Hillary Clinton's house in search of her controversial private emails? I doubt it, somehow. And I'll pause there and say, the context missing, of course. For those that are not historically on either side, but may find themselves more aligned with Republicans simply due to having read the news, is that Hillary Clinton was investigated peacefully. They didn't raid her house. They took the emails, they reviewed them, and they found that she did have confidential information. She wasn't charged. Donald Trump was subject to a false FBI investigation, tens of millions of dollars in Russiagate. The context is very different, good sir. I implore you, please read the history of the Donald Trump presidency, Russiagate, Ukrainegate, the lies and the smears, to understand why people do not trust what happened with the FBI. He continues, it works the other way around too. The same Democrats glorifying in Mr. Trump's embarrassment today would have been appalled if the FBI had applied the same tactics to Mrs. Clinton yesterday. You don't hear many liberal Democrats wondering if the FBI was a bit heavy-handed, just as you don't find many conservative Republicans insisting that nobody is above the law. And you don't find many pro-slavery Southerners in 1856 rushing to condemn Preston Brooks. In the 2020s, as in the 1850s, the tribalism is total and partisanship is all wrong. What he's right about. We're on a dangerous path. We need to do whatever it is we can to prevent things from de-escalating further. We should all condemn the man who went to the FBI office. All. Why? If Republicans do win in November, they can use the powers of the purse to defund. They can hold the FBI accountable in a way that a single lunatic cannot. But if lunatics like this get violent, you will not win. And people will vote for law and order to stop it. While I agree with the interesting context here at Unheard, the both sidesism, unfortunately, is incorrect. But an interesting point, nonetheless, is that in the end, you need only stand back and realize that something is standing before us. Perhaps you agree with me. It's a double standard, and we've read the news. We understand this. It is not just Republicans. Naomi Wolf, who said they are criminalizing being Republican, is a liberal, a feminist, and a historically active Democrat. But now, things have changed. When people like Naomi Wolf can come on Timcast IRL, she came on the other day, watch the show, and say they're trying to criminalize being a Republican and a civil war is coming. It is not tribalism. It is a death cult and everyone else. And Trump has his sycophants, and Trump has his cult, but they are not prominent. What's happening now, regardless of what you think is right or wrong, is that escalation is upon us. He goes on to say, to get a sense of what today's successors to those antebellum Southern editorialists are thinking, I turned on Fox News. First up was the conservative classical historian Victor Davis Hanson. Biden administration is using Soviet-style tactics to crush its political opponents. Read the banner at the bottom of the screen. Hansen was in no doubt. The FBI raid was a plot by the Democrats running the national security state. They believe they're morally superior to America and therefore any means are necessary to justifiable for their morally superior ends. He said grimly, right now, we don't have the rule of law in Washington. That, I thought, is a pretty bleak thing to say about your own government. An odd thing, too, since the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, is an avowed card-carrying Republican. But of course, if this man who wrote this knew anything, he'd know that Liz Cheney is as well, and she has almost no support from Republicans. I had a quick look at his biography. It turns out he went to the same New York private school as Donald Trump Jr., then the same Massachusetts boarding school, Phillips Academy, as the two Bush presidents. He served in Bush's administration and was appointed to run the FBI by Donald Trump himself. That's correct, but it doesn't change the facts about what's happening. Perhaps it was because Donald Trump wanted to fire the man, or perhaps because Donald Trump knew he made a mistake. But I want to cite Naomi Wolf, who made an interesting point yesterday. She said, walk backwards, work backwards. When looking at these things, don't listen to why they claim to be doing it. Go backwards from what they did. It's interesting. I take a look at where we are now, what the results are, and then I walk backwards. And I don't think justifications matter. Of course, any person who commits a crime will make an excuse. I'm innocent, I'm being framed, or I had no choice. Often there will be crime. Ocasio-Cortez famously said, because people need bread. Pretty sure the dude who is, like stealing a cell phone, it's not about bread. But for some people, when they steal bread, it is. You work backwards. When you take a look at the damage being done, the escalation, and the potentiality for real violence, you ask why it happened. Certainly people know the outcome of the actions they take, especially the FBI, who's been tracking all of this violence, right? The FBI has been tracking this violence. They know, don't they? It sounds then, when you work backwards from where we are, history starts to paint a different picture. We are in the thick of things. We go day by day. The revolutionary period was over 20 years. The Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party were years apart. Years! But when we look back in history, it's condensed. What I mean to say is, we are in uncondensed history today. Days go by with no news, nothing happening. And like frogs in a pot, we boil, not realizing just how insane things have gotten. So I like to walk backwards. And I'd put it this way. Go back in time, 5 years. If I did, and back then I told you, the year is 2022, it is August. A man armed with a rifle enters an FBI building and fires a nail gun at FBI staff. The Democrats have just voted to expand the IRS by 87,000 agents. The president's home was raided by the FBI. Members of his administration have been arrested and convicted. One man was shackled at the feet. If I told you those things, if I said on January 6th of 2021, hundreds, nearly 1,000 individuals entered the Capitol grounds, many of which storming in, seeking an end to the electoral vote count because they believe the election was stolen. Would you believe me? Of course you wouldn't. And I know you wouldn't. Not all of you, but many of you. How do I know this? In 2018, I said, we are on track for a civil war. And the response I received from everybody was, Tim, you're insane. Antifa fighting the Proud Boys is not a civil war. It's weirdo lunatics. And I said, look at history. Look at where this leads to. People just said, no. I remember hearing from prominent conservatives saying the security state is too strong to allow anything like that to happen. In my response, what happens when the culture war reaches the highest level of government? Sure, right now the government isn't engaged in a culture war. It was a little bit with Donald Trump, but it wasn't as fractured. They were as conflict. I mean, there was Russiagate for sure. And I said, what happens when half of the FBI is woke and half the FBI is anti-woke? Then you get breakdown. And people said that can never happen. It won't happen. It did happen. It's happening all around us. It's easy to look back at the past several years and pinpoint all of these key moments that signify we are in a historical moment. In 50 years, they will look back on these days, and it will be condensed down into a neat little one-page article. What caused the Second Civil War? I don't know if it escalates to the point where we will refer to it that way. But enough has happened. Enough has happened that we are getting close to 1860s. Bleeding Kansas. I believe it was 7 years that led up to the Civil War. It was a state civil war in Kansas over whether or not they would be a slave state or a free state. John Brown was particularly active. He walked up and blasted a man in the face. Interesting. In Portland, A guy walked up to a man named Aaron Danielson and put 2 in his chest for no reason other than, as we believe, he was a Trump supporter. They yelled something like, "We got one here." And then he just drew up and killed him. The DOJ under Trump hunted down this man and killed him. They said he was going for his weapon. Maybe, I don't know. All of these things. A couple of years ago, I think it was, a man showed up to an ICE facility in Tacoma with a ghost gun, a rifle, and fire bombs. And he attempted to firebomb an ICE facility. He was killed. Numerous instances like this have been occurring. So we may be in the bleeding Kansas phase of a pre-Civil War. Or maybe we're able to stop it. The fourth turning prescribes a major moment to occur in the next few years. Every 80 years, this country goes through a tumultuous period, the fourth turning. We had the War for Independence. 80 years later, we had a Civil War. 80 years later, we had World Wars I and II. And that's amazing. I suppose World War I, 80 years after the Civil War. Or I should say it was about between 60 and 80 years. So that was a long period of chaos, international chaos. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe someone was like, hey, this happened 3 times. Maybe it'll happen a 4th. Not perfect speculation. Or maybe with everything we're seeing, we're headed towards something dark. Now he goes on to make his both sidism point, and he concludes by saying, even at a grassroots level, you can see signs of trouble. Writing for Unheard in January, the essayist James Pogue reported that in his rural Northern California county, there is a very totalizing war of worldviews, touched off by the pandemic and resistance to expert advice and state action, led by a militia-aligned faction that thinks the local government betrayed the county's free living values by participating in California's COVID protocols. There haven't, Pogue noted, been any bombings or shootings, but there have been fights, and much of the local police force is more or less openly sympathetic to the radical faction. The right in this country is now almost entirely alienated from the other structures of government, and it is hard to see how the situation could change. Too bleak? Perhaps. When I visited America before Easter, it didn't feel like a country on the brink. The sun shone, shops were busy, people wandered happily about, as friendly and hospitable as ever. In 2 weeks, I didn't hear a single remark about politics, nor did I see a single MAGA hat or a Trump shirt. And this is in Florida. But I would probably have said similar things in the summer of 1856, too. The sun often shines before the storm. And perhaps, good sir, you would be standing atop the hillside overlooking Fort Sumter, along with all the other good picnic-going Americans who could not believe a civil war would erupt. And perhaps you were wrong. Perhaps things are darker than you realize. A few honorable mentions in this segment. Twitter is preparing their election strategy to manipulate information and control it. They say it's about stopping misinformation. I think it's about controlling the flow of it, what they deem to be right. We know where that goes. Polling shows, shockingly, that Democrats who plan to vote in the GOP primary in Wyoming, because it's open, 97.8 will vote for Liz Cheney. Very interesting. Of the Republican votes, 68% say Harriet Hageman. Will enough Democrats intervene? 43% of independents say they'd vote for Liz Cheney. The system is broken beyond repair, my friends. I don't know what to do, but this violence cannot be tolerated. I'll leave it there. Next segment is coming up at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimcastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all then.